The unanswered summons from the Vicarage bells, a Miss Marple mystery. Hi there, welcome back to Haunting Vales. Tonight's mystery begins with the ringing of the Vicarage bells, clear, urgent, and unanswered. In St. Mary Mead, those bells were never rung without reason, and certainly never ignored. Yet on this particular evening, they rang again and again, echoing across the village as doors remained closed and no one came to answer the call. By morning, a troubling discovery is made, and the villagers are quick to call it a sad misunderstanding. Miss Marple, however, hears something different in the silence that followed the bells, a warning overlooked, a message meant for someone who never arrived. As she pieces together the events of that night, she realizes the bells were not calling for help, but pointing toward the truth. Because in St. Mary Mead, even a summons left unanswered can reveal exactly who was meant to listen. Before we uncover why the bells rang in vain, don't forget to subscribe for more haunting Miss Marple mysteries on Haunting Vales. Chapter 1: The Unanswered Summons from the Vicarage Bells. The bells of St. Stephen's Vicarage were not meant to ring at that hour. In the village of St. Mary Mead, bells followed a rhythm as dependable as the tides: weddings at noon, funerals in the soft hush of late afternoon, Sunday services precisely on time. Anything else was an intrusion, a disturbance to the village's carefully ordered life. So when the bells began to toll just after dawn, low and deliberate, they woke more than sleepers. They woke unease. Miss Jane Marple heard them from her bed, lying very still beneath her quilt, counting each measured stroke. 1, 2, 3. She frowned slightly, not in irritation but in thought. Bells, she believed, were much like people. They did not act without reason. If they did, the reason was usually troubling. Outside, mist lay thick upon the lanes, blurring hedges and cottages into pale shapes. The sound of the bells moved through the fog as if carried by invisible hands, reaching kitchen tables where tea had gone cold and bedrooms where villagers sat up, suddenly alert. By the fifth toll, curtains were drawn aside and heads appeared at windows. By the 10th, whispers had begun. Miss Marple rose and dressed with calm efficiency, choosing a sensible cardigan and fastening it carefully. She did not hurry. Haste, in her experience, led to missed details. As she made her way downstairs, the bells ceased abruptly, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the sound itself. At the vicarage, the bell rope hung slack. Vicar Leonard Hawthorne was not a man given to drama. He was known for his steady sermons, his precise handwriting, and his punctual habits. When he rang the bells, there was always a reason and usually a notice pinned neatly to the church board to explain it. This time, there was no notice. Only the unanswered summons that now echoed in the minds of the villagers. By mid-morning, the village had gathered in clusters. Outside the Blue Boar Inn, Mrs. Price shook her head gravely while recounting the moment she had heard the bells. Near the post office, Mr. Gibbs insisted it must have been a mistake, though he did not sound convinced. Everyone agreed on one thing: someone ought to check on the vicar. It was Miss Marple's nephew, Raymond West, who happened to pass near the vicarage first. He later said that what struck him most was the door. It stood slightly open, as though someone had meant to close it and had not quite managed to do so. Inside, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Vicar Hawthorne was found in his study, seated at his desk, his hands folded neatly before him. At first glance, he appeared merely to be resting. It was only upon closer inspection that the truth became clear. He was quite dead. The village constable was summoned, then the doctor. Word spread swiftly, carried with the efficiency only a small village could manage. By noon, St. Mary Mead was wrapped in speculation. The bells had not rung for worship. They had rung as a call. A call that no one had answered in time. Miss Marple arrived at the vicarage later that afternoon, having been invited by Mrs. Hawthorne, the vicar's distant cousin and housekeeper, who was pale and visibly shaken. The house smelled faintly of old books and extinguished candles. Miss Marple paused in the doorway of the study, her sharp eyes taking in the scene without appearing to do so. There was nothing obviously amiss. No overturned furniture, no broken glass. The desk was orderly. The papers were stacked neatly, as always. Yet something was wrong. Miss Marple felt it as surely as she felt a change in the weather. She listened as the doctor spoke quietly to the constable, noting the careful words chosen. Heart failure, possibly. Stress, perhaps. The vicar had been under some strain, it seemed. Miss Marple inclined her head politely, but she did not agree. She had known men like Leonard Hawthorne. Calm on the surface, yes, but not careless with their own lives. And certainly not prone to dramatic gestures without purpose. Later, over tea in the vicarage sitting room, Miss Marple learned that the bells had been rung manually. Someone had pulled the rope. Someone with intention. Mrs. Hawthorne insisted it must have been Leonard himself. He often rose early, she said. Perhaps he felt unwell and rang for help. Miss Marple smiled gently, stirring her tea. Did he ever do so before, she asked. Mrs. Hawthorne hesitated. No, not that I can recall. That, Miss Marple thought, was the beginning of the puzzle. Over the next day, small details emerged. The bell rope bore faint marks, as though it had been pulled with unusual force. The vicar's watch had stopped at precisely 5 minutes past 6. A letter lay half-written in his desk drawer, addressed to no one, its final sentence trailing off into nothing. And then there was the matter of the visitor seen leaving the vicarage just before dawn. Mrs. Jenkins, who suffered from sleeplessness and sharp eyesight, claimed she had seen a figure in a dark coat hurrying away down the lane. She could not say whether it was a man or a woman, only that the person walked quickly and did not look back. Some dismissed her account as imagination. Miss Marple did not. She reflected, as she often did, on the curious ways people behaved when frightened. Bells, she knew, could be rung to call attention, to summon help, or to create confusion. In her youth, there had been a case involving a factory whistle and a missing ledger. The principle, she felt, was much the same. That evening, as the village settled into uneasy quiet, Miss Marple sat by her window, knitting forgotten in her lap. The mist had returned, thick and persistent. Somewhere in the distance, the church tower loomed, its bells silent now, their message already delivered. The unanswered summons from the vicarage bells was not a cry for help, she was sure of it. It was a signal. And like all signals, it was meant for someone in particular. Miss Marple smiled faintly to herself. The village might believe the mystery ended with a doctor's verdict. She knew better. The bells had spoken. And she intended to listen very carefully to what they had truly said. Chapter 2, The Echo That Lingered in St. Mary Mead. In the days following Vicar Hawthorne's death, St. Mary Mead settled into a state of restless politeness. Curtains were drawn a little tighter, voices lowered just enough to suggest respect, and every conversation, no matter how it began, found its way back to the bells. The sound had faded, but the echo remained, lingering in kitchens, on garden paths, and in the careful pauses people left between their words. The official verdict, quietly circulated by the constable, was natural causes. The doctor maintained his opinion with professional firmness. The vicar, he said, had likely suffered a sudden collapse. Stress could do such things, even to a man who appeared calm. The matter, as far as the authorities were concerned, was closed. Miss Marple did not argue. She rarely did. Instead, she listened. She attended the small gathering held after the vicar's burial, seated near the window with her hands folded neatly in her lap. From there, she observed the villagers as they moved about the room, offering condolences that were sincere enough but tinged with curiosity. Grief, she knew, often shared space with other emotions, especially when death arrived unexpectedly. Mrs. Hawthorne sat stiffly in an armchair, her eyes red but dry. She accepted sympathy with a nod, yet there was something guarded in her manner. She spoke of her cousin Leonard as a good man, devoted to his duties, though she made no mention of affection. Miss Marple found that interesting. People who lived closely together usually revealed more than they intended, even in their silences. Near the fireplace, Mr. Calder, the churchwarden, cleared his throat repeatedly before speaking, as though each sentence required careful approval from his conscience. He spoke at length about the vicar's dedication to the church accounts, how meticulous he had been, how nothing was ever out of place. Miss Marple noticed that his praise focused less on the man and more on the records he kept. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a visit to the church itself. The doors stood open, and the air inside was cool and still. Sunlight filtered through the windows, casting pale shapes across the stone floor. She made her way slowly toward the bell tower, resting her hand on the worn wood of the pews as she passed. The bell rope hung exactly as she had seen it before, thick and rough beneath her fingers. She did not pull it. She merely examined it, noting the faint discoloration near the handle. It reminded her of a case long ago involving a gardener who claimed to have cut his hand on a thorn. The stain on the glove had told a different story. Outside, she encountered Mrs. Price, who had come to tidy the flower arrangements. Mrs. Price was eager to talk. She always was. "I still can't understand why he would ring the bells so early," she said, lowering her voice despite the empty churchyard. "It's not like him at all." "People sometimes do unusual things when they are worried," Miss Marple replied gently. Mrs. Price leaned closer. "Do you think he was worried, then?" Miss Marple smiled. "I think he was concerned about something, yes." That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Raymond West arrived just before supper, his expression thoughtful. He had been helping the constable with a few practical matters and had learned more than the official story suggested. "There was someone else at the vicarage that morning," he said quietly, once they were seated. "Not just the housekeeper. The back gate showed signs of being opened and closed recently. And the latch was wiped clean." Miss Marple nodded. People often tidy up after themselves when they believe they have done something wrong. Raymond frowned. "You think this was not natural at all?" "I think," Miss Marple replied, choosing her words carefully, "that bells are not rung without purpose. And that purpose was not medical." The next clue arrived in an unexpected form. A parcel, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, was delivered to Miss Marple's cottage. Inside was a book borrowed from the vicarage library weeks earlier and returned anonymously. Tucked between its pages was a small slip of paper bearing a single word written in Leonard Hawthorne's careful hand, "Accounts." Miss Marple sat very still for a long moment. Accounts were powerful things. She had seen friendships end and families divided over them. Numbers, she reflected, had a way of exposing truths people preferred to keep hidden. The following morning, she requested permission to look through the church records. Mr. Calder agreed readily, perhaps too readily, unlocking the cabinet with hands that trembled just slightly. Miss Marple leafed through the ledgers at an unhurried pace, her eyes sharp behind her spectacles. At first, everything appeared in order. Then she noticed the gaps. Small sums recorded twice. Larger ones missing altogether. Nothing obvious enough to alarm a casual glance, but enough to trouble someone who knew what to look for. "So careful," Miss Marple murmured. "And yet not careful enough." As she closed the ledger, she recalled the half-written letter found in the vicar's desk. She had not seen it herself, but she knew how such letters were begun. People started them when they meant to explain, or accuse, or warn. They stopped when interrupted. Interrupted, perhaps, by a visitor at dawn. That afternoon, Miss Marple took her usual walk through the village lanes. She greeted neighbors, admired gardens, and listened. Mr. Gibbs mentioned seeing light in the vicarage window very early that morning. Mrs. Jenkins insisted again upon the dark-coated figure, adding now that the person had paused briefly by the church gate, as though listening. Listening for bells, Miss Marple thought. By the time she returned home, the pattern was forming clearly in her mind. Someone had gone to the vicarage before dawn. Words had been exchanged. The bells had been rung, not in panic, but as a final act of intention. A signal meant to draw attention, to ensure something could not be quietly buried. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gazed out at the fading light. Whoever had heard the summons and understood it was already afraid. And fear, she knew, was the most reliable guide to truth. The echo of the bells still lingered in St. Mary Mead. And soon, very soon, it would lead her directly to the hand that had silenced them forever. Chapter 3, When the Bells Finally Answered. The morning Miss Marple decided to act, St. Mary Mead awoke beneath a sky the color of dull pewter. It was the sort of morning that pressed down upon the spirit, heavy with unshed rain and unspoken things. Miss Marple rather welcomed it. Such weather, she believed, encouraged honesty. People found it harder to pretend when the world itself seemed weary of false appearances. She began, as she often did, with something deceptively ordinary. Invitations. By mid-morning, word spread that Miss Marple would be receiving a few villagers for tea. Nothing unusual in that. She was known for her hospitality, her excellent sponge cake, and her quiet manners. Yet those who received her invitation felt a faint stirring of unease they could not quite explain. Perhaps it was the timing. Perhaps it was simply that Miss Marple rarely did anything without reason. Mr. Calder arrived first, precisely on time. He removed his hat and glanced about the sitting room with forced cheerfulness, commenting on the weather. Mrs. Hawthorne followed, stiff-backed and pale, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap. Mrs. Price came next, wide-eyed and eager, clearly thrilled to be included. Raymond West arrived last, offering his aunt a look of subtle encouragement before taking his seat near the window. Miss Marple poured tea herself, her movements unhurried. She spoke first of trivial things, of the roses that had failed to bloom properly that year, of the way the mist had lingered too long in the lanes. Gradually, conversation settled into a cautious rhythm. Only then did she set her cup aside. "It is a curious thing," she said mildly, "how bells have been used throughout history. Not only to call people together, but to mark danger, or loss, or even wrongdoing." There was a pause. Mr. Calder cleared his throat. "I'm not sure I follow, Miss Marple," he said. "No, She replied gently, "I imagine you are not." She turned her gaze toward Mrs. Hawthorne. "Your cousin was a conscientious man. Thorough. Careful. He kept records with great attention, did he not?" Mrs. Hawthorne nodded slowly. "Yes." Leonard believed order was a moral duty. "Indeed," Miss Marple agreed. Which is why he noticed when order was disturbed. Mrs. Price leaned forward. "You mean the church money?" Miss Marple smiled faintly. "I mean the accounts." Mr. Calder shifted in his chair. "Those ledgers have been examined," he said quickly. "There was nothing conclusive." "Nothing obvious," Miss Marple corrected. "But enough to trouble a man who understood what he was seeing." She reached for a small notebook on the table beside her and opened it. There were irregularities. Small ones at first. Then larger. Funds moved carefully, quietly, over time. Always just enough not to attract attention. Mrs. Hawthorne's lips tightened. "Are you accusing someone?" "I am explaining why Leonard Hawthorne rang the bells," Miss Marple said. Silence settled heavily in the room. "He discovered the truth," Miss Marple continued. "And being the man he was, he intended to confront it. He wrote a letter. He gathered his courage. And when the person responsible came to see him that morning, he made a decision." Raymond spoke quietly. "The bells." "Yes," Miss Marple said. "Not as a cry for help, but as a declaration. A signal that something was wrong. That I should turn toward the church and its affairs." Mrs. Price looked from face to face. "But then he died." Miss Marple inclined her head. He was silenced. Mr. Calder rose abruptly. "This is absurd," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. "You have no proof." Miss Marple looked up at him. "On the contrary, I have quite enough." She described the duplicate entries, the missing sums, the careful pattern that pointed not to carelessness but to long practice. She spoke of the wiped latch on the back gate, the early morning visit, the bell rope pulled with deliberate force. She mentioned the anonymous return of the book and the single word hidden within its pages. Leonard Hawthorne knew he might not be believed, she said softly. So he left traces. He trusted that someone would look closely enough. Mrs. Hawthorne's voice trembled. "You think he was killed for this?" "I believe," Miss Marple said, "that he was frightened, but determined. And that determination made him dangerous to someone." Mr. Calder sank back into his chair, his face grey. "I never meant it to go so far," he whispered. Mrs. Price gasped. Raymond did not move. "The money was only borrowed at first," Mr. Calder went on, his words spilling out now. "I meant to put it back. The repairs, the bills, everything kept adding up." Leonard began asking questions. "I went to reason with him. He was already weak. The argument, it was too much for him." Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. "And when he collapsed, you fled. But not before trying to erase what he had begun." The constable arrived shortly thereafter, summoned quietly by Raymond. Mr. Calder did not resist. He looked older somehow as he was led away, the burden of years pressing visibly upon him. When the door closed behind them, the room felt strangely empty. "The bells did their work after all," Mrs. Hawthorne said faintly. "Yes," Miss Marple replied. "They were answered. Just not as quickly as Leonard might have hoped." That evening, as dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat once more by her window. The church tower stood dark against the sky, its bells silent. Yet their message had carried far enough. Some truths, she reflected, required patience. Others required courage. And occasionally, they required a summons so unmistakable that it could not be ignored. If you enjoyed unraveling this quiet but chilling mystery with Miss Marple, do remember to like, subscribe, and share this story. More unanswered summons, hidden truths, and village secrets await, and you would not want to miss the next bell that rings.